SHRM Linkage is proud to be a partner of All Things Work. For more than 25 years, organizations and their leaders have attended the SHRM Linkage Institute for data-driven leadership development with a focus on advancing women leaders. This Women's History Month, commit to meeting the unique needs of women in the workplace. Register yourself or your team for the SHRM Linkage Institute at shrm.co/institute.
Welcome to Honest HR. I'm your host, Nicole Belyna. Today, we're exploring workplace dress codes. And joining us is Deron Lehman, Chief Human Resources Officer of Barber National Institute. Welcome to Honest HR, Deron.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm pleased to be here with you in the audience.
And I'm thrilled to have you. To kick things off, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background in HR?
Sure. You mentioned where I currently work, and my current organization, we do intellectual and learning disability services for folks with autism and behavioral health challenges. And prior to this, I've worked extensively in nonprofit space, for-profit, and the government sector. And I come from a broad background of operational support as well as HR support. And like many folks in the audience, I probably fell into HR by accident because I was focused on business process redesign and efficiency. And I realized that people were underserved, and that led me into HR to have the people lens on all of the things that I do.
That's great. So today we're going to talk about dress code. Why is it important for workplaces to have a dress code?
Well, I think at its core, it's about creating clarity and consistency and expectations. So for every organization, we want to create that clarity and consistency for employees. And I think in the case of a dress code, it should really be driven by need. So in some cases, there's going to be differences amongst teams, but there are definitely safety issues that come into play that we want to address, as well as comfort and professionalism when it comes to a dress code.
Yeah. And so should an entire organization have one dress code? And you kind of answer this, but is it okay for different departments to create their own dress code?
I think it is okay to have differences if we can explain the why behind it and we be consistent. So, for my case, we have different business lines within our organization. So in some areas, we have a uniform that's required. In other cases, it's much more professional. And in some cases, there's safety requirements that drive the dress code. But we do clearly document each service line's business dress code.
So how can organizations balance the need for professionalism while still allowing for employee comfort and individuality in their dress code policies?
Yeah, I think it comes down to including employees in the conversation. So when you're forming a dress code or revising a dress code, I think it's important to form employee groups and be inclusive to hear and understand what employees would like to see in the workplace based on the culture and their position requirements. And then allow employees to be part of that change. Let them help draft the dress code if that's appropriate for the culture, and ensure that employees understand the why behind the final dress code in case there are differences between what employees want and what the organization needs.
And so you talked about, being inclusive. How do dress codes intersect with inclusion and diversity? And what strategies can HR professionals use to ensure policies are equitable and culturally sensitive?
Sure. I think dress code really can be impacted by inclusivity, and there's a variety of factors that come into play. So again, I think it goes back to having employees be part of the change, as I referenced earlier, and very clearly listening to the feedback that employees give you so that you're considering all cultural or other aspects that they bring to the table. And then, in the final dress code, if it's plausible, allow for some variation in dress code. Obviously, there are religious reasons or cultural reasons that your staff may want to dress a certain way. And it's important to be sensitive to that and allow for some neutrality in the dress code, allow for that. And I think as an undergirder, just be sure it aligns with culture and provides a safe environment.
Yeah, those are great points. How do dress codes impact employee perceptions of company culture and values? And what role can HR play in aligning these perceptions with organizational goals?
Sure. I think, it speaks for dress code as well as other policies that the HR team may develop. But the more detailed, defined, and strict a policy is, that sort of indicates what the culture may be like as well. If it's a very lax policy, it also can relate to the culture. So I think, framing the dress policy around the cultural norm is a critical component. And then aligning the policy so that the standards and the enforcement of the policy are uniform and, again, reflective of the culture. So is it very strict, or do we allow adults to have choices in what they do?
Sure. Yeah, those are great points. And, earlier you mentioned dress code around safety, right? And then we've just addressed dress code as it relates to company culture. Earlier in my career, I supported a number of retail organizations, specifically in apparel, where dress code, really allows people to demonstrate their individuality and also their alignment with the company culture and pride in the brand. So dress code really can be a factor of safety, culture, and then, as we mentioned, ensuring that there's inclusivity and that we're being culturally sensitive as well.
That's a great point. I think brand comes into play. And again, allowing for flexibility, and whether it's casual Friday, jeans Friday, and allow days for branded wear is a really critical component, because it really creates a sense of pride in the organization and culture when you can gift employees apparel and they can display it.
There you go. Have you observed generational differences in attitudes toward workplace attire? Maybe, you have some employees who feel that the dress code should be more strict or more lax. And if so, how should HR address these differences when shaping dress code policies?
Sure, you bring up a great point. And, there's, of course, the stereotype that an older generation wants to be more formal and thinks we should be business formal in the office all the time. And in some cases, that stereotype is true, and in some cases, they're not. But absolutely reflecting on generations as well as the other cultural norms are a critical component when it comes to formulating the dress code. And I think you deal with it just like you have the rest of the factors. You evaluate and ensure that we communicate the why behind the final dress code. But ultimately, being neutral in the dress code is the most appropriate, because it does allow employees to bring their individual approach to it, regardless of their age, generation, or styles.
So we're seeing an increasing shift to hybrid and remote work environments. How should organizations rethink dress codes to fit in these new workplace dynamics?
I think that brings a lot of changes to the workplace, dress code not being standing alone. But, I think the undergirder for all of the dress code is to be consistent. So whether you're on screen, working from home, a coffee shop, or in the office, the dress code needs to be uniformly administered. I think, we need to consider the fact that people want to be comfortable. So whether they're in the office or at home, let them be comfortable. And, again, there's all the discussion about people maybe being very formal up top in a dress shirt and tie and sweatpants, down below, or shorts come summer. And, I think that's okay. Let people, represent themselves as they want and be comfortable. Just stay off camera if you're in shorts.
There you go. How can HR approach dress code changes such as transitioning to a more relaxed or, you mentioned comfortable or remote friendly standard without causing confusion or pushback among employees?
Sure. I think documenting how the requirements are critical. So to go back, employees want to be included in change, and to get early buy-in from employees can be critical. So let the employees be part of that change process, provide comment, even help draft the dress policy if appropriate, and then be sure that you over-communicate. The greater clarity we create, the more impactful it will be in understanding. And I also think, as with any policy, it's important to train managers first, because managers ultimately are responsible for administering and enforcing the dress code on a daily basis. So being sure that they're clear on the expectations will help create clarity amongst their teams.
That's a great point. In some organizations, I've seen where they give examples of what they want their dress code to look like. So it's not just a policy, but there's also, kind of recommendations of apparel. What is your take on that?
I think it's great. I think we want to use stock photos and not necessarily employee photos for that. But I've worked in an organization where we also did a bit of a fashion show when we'd have an all-employee meeting. And we do that typically at the change of seasons. So especially before summer, when shorts may be worn in the outside world, but not the employment world, just to reinforce the message. And then they do get to see their peers, buying into the culture and the dress code and really looking up to them for that.
What are some of the challenges HR teams face when handling dress code violations? And how can they address the situations while promoting fairness and respect?
Sure. I think that, some of the issues that HR faces is when managers don't uniformly administer the dress code. And it could be different managers on different teams, but they have the same dress code. So it's important that those managers uniformly address it across teams, but especially within a team. Oftentimes there's a manager who can show favoritism, or they don't recognize that they're showing favoritism to some employees over others. So it's important to coach managers on that uniform enforcement. I also think it's very important to listen to feedback that employees give. So if you're calling an employee in, of course, do the conversation in private. You never want to do it in public. But question the employee, ask them if they understand the dress code, and ask them why they dress in a certain way. Help them understand the gap between what's expected and what they're wearing or what choice they made, to help them make better decisions when it comes to the dress code for the future, not just for that time frame.
And something that I've seen in my career is, a people manager might come to me and say that they have a dress code issue with an employee on their team. And, as I talk through this situation with the people manager, we discover that it's not necessarily that the employee is out of dress code, but rather it's a matter of taste from the people manager's perspective. And so how can you coach a people manager through that situation to help them understand the difference between dress code and, perhaps trying to police people's fashion at work?
Well, the fashion crisis is a real one in today's world. So I think it's really important, especially going back to the conversation about, having the fashion show or showing examples of dress code. I think it's important to have a variation in what's acceptable and not just pull today's fashion. So you could have a 70s outfit or, an 80s outfit along with the today outfit, and, demonstrate that to the employees and managers. And then, of course, coaching the manager through, maybe not criticizing their style of dress, but talking about how we can be inclusive in the work environment, and that it's not a fashion choice, but a dress code based on the standard and professionalism.
Yeah, I think that also goes back to inclusivity too, right? Just staying focused on what's in the dress code versus personal judgments.
Absolutely. Stick to the script, if you will. So focus on the dress code and allow people to have choices and flexibility when it comes to that.
And so what are 2 to 3 pieces of advice HR teams should keep in mind when drafting and enforcing dress code policies?
Sure. I think that, being inclusive is the critical component. Incorporating employees and managers into the change or the initial draft is a critical component. We want people to buy in, and if we don't include them, they'll feel blindsided. So that's a critical first step. The second point I would say is be intentional. So whatever the final dress code is, have a strong why behind it. So whether there's differences among different service lines or a uniform code, be able to explain if there are differences across teams or why it's uniform and maybe strictly enforced. And then I think, show support for managers. Teach and empower your managers to enforce the dress code, to fully understand the dress code nuances that may come into play. Be sure they understand inclusivity and individuality, and then help them as a backstop for them, not enabling them by bringing issues to you, but empowering them to deal with issues on the front line in a consistent manner.
Yeah, that's great. So just to recap, it sounds like, your 3 pieces of advice focus on, being inclusive in the messaging, including employees in crafting or updating the dress code, and providing transparency would be the next one. And then, ensuring that it aligns with the organization's culture. Absolutely.
I think cultural pieces are the foundation for all the policies. So I think it's important that the dress code reflect that, because people will align, they come into an organization to be part of the culture. and dress code should align with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love the last thing that you said about, reinforcing with people managers. I think having, a few different ways of how you communicate the dress code, giving the coaching to the people managers so that they understand the dress code from a people manager perspective, and also coaching them on, how they might address any dress code issues within their team is also very sage advice for sure, getting their buy-in.
Absolutely. And that applies for all policies. And, as HR, we need to empower managers more. This is one great avenue to do that with.
Absolutely. Anything else? Any key takeaways you want to share about dress code?
Yeah, I think overall, I would just refresh your dress code periodically, whether it's in a engagement survey or a pulse survey, check in on dress code periodically just to be sure that it's still aligned and appropriate and that there aren't nuances that come up. And, as we discussed earlier, we don't need to reflect style changes, but certainly job changes and industry changes can impact. And we don't often think of that, when things that happen on the front line that we're not aware of in HR because we're functioning behind the scenes in most cases.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, that's going to do it for this week's episode of Honest HR. A big, big thank you to Deron for sharing his deep insights with us. Thank you, Deron.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you to your audience.
This episode is supported by SHRM Linkage. Learn more about the SHRM Linkage Institute's data-driven approach to advancing women leaders at shrm.co/institute.
SHRM. This podcast is approved to provide 0.5 professional development credits, or PDCs, towards SHRM CP and SHRM SCP recertification. Enter the following PDC activity ID into your SHRM activity portal to claim your credit. 26-7FZPJ. Again, the PDC activity ID is 26-7FZPJ. Please note that this code expires April 1st, 2026.